Alright, so I just got out from yet another administrative appearance in an administrative court, and I just took yet another small step towards, fighting back. Now let me get to my basement and I'll explain to you how this works. Let's explore! Hello everyone and welcome to the Freedom Alternative. Okay, so this is a video that I've been avoiding making largely because I may inadvertently introduce confusion into the conversation. But there are also other reasons, such as, trade secret, laziness, and of course, indecisiveness on what's appropriate in a video and what isn't. Nevertheless, since the pandemic project, administrative warfare became the #1 activity here with the sofa, surpassing video making and lobbying. Also, there's more demand than ever to both yours truly and to our partners for classes on how to navigate the administrative state and use it in one's favor against bureaucrats who have it coming. So, in light of these developments, it is perhaps high time to explain at least some of the basics of this particular facet of practical politics. It's not terribly complicated, but it is time-consuming. It requires patience, attention to details, and a willingness to persist against seemingly impossible odds. Administrative lawfare is a very powerful weapon that can inflict severe damage upon a lot of people who are at fault for various ills in our societies, which is precisely why the regime invests so much money and time into shills whose job is to discourage you from even trying. Some of you have seen this during the pandemic project for the first time, but it's been going on for decades. Also, if done wrongly, administrative lawfare can become a nightmare or create the impression that it is ineffective. Done correctly, it is the most effective tool to achieve less visible but highly important goals, such as firing a bureaucrat, bankrupting a member of an illegitimate profession, such as medical doctors or experts, and can even be used to take over an institution, though that's for the pro level, and there are routinely better ways to take over an institution than administrative lawfare. Alright, so before I begin, I will say this. When I say administrative lawfare or administrative warfare or administrative nightmares, I refer to the totality of actions that are perfectly legal but do not involve the well-known methods of achieving justice, but rather rely on Alinsky principles and a very deep knowledge of procedure. Now, when I say procedure, everyone understands something different. So, by procedure, I mean the infra-legal and paralegal regulations and legal texts that deal with the way certain legislation is supposed to be executed or enforced. Every country has them, though not all of them call it procedure. In Europe, they are usually called procedure, so I will stick with the Roman law terminology, though I'll try, if I don't forget, to provide the Anglo-Saxon equivalent as well. Let me give you an example. Law number 15 per 2016 concerning the modification and updating of law number 349 per 2002 concerning the preventing and combating of the effects of consumption of tobacco-based products. Basically, the anti-smoking law in Romania. Its main article says as follows, quote, "Smoking is forbidden in all closed public spaces at one's job, common transportation means, and children's playgrounds. From these provisions will be exempted the cells dedicated to the inmates in maximum security penitentiaries," end quote. So, by smoking right now, I'm breaking the law, right? Well, no, because legally speaking, this is not a job. There is no employer. But there's another issue. What is a closed space? The law doesn't say, and many people are tempted to assume that, well, that is self-evident. No, it's not. If the definition is not provided, then you don't know. So it was left to the ministries to regulate that. The totality of those texts are called the methodological norms and are supposed to describe how and where a particular piece of legislation is applied. And by carefully reading those, we can notice that in fact this law can be ignored in nearly all situations. For instance, the obligation for a bar or a nightclub is to display that smoking is forbidden, but they have no obligation to kick out customers who do. Then there is the issue of who is allowed to issue sanctions. Everyone just assumed that, well, that falls to the police, but that's not true. In fact, the original legislation says that officials from the Ministry of Health should do it. But there's just one problem. The Ministry of Health doesn't have the legal right nor the enforcement infrastructure to fine pretty much anyone that is not a hospital, let alone random plebs. And when they did try during the pandemic project, they found out the hard way that that is a terrible idea, and not just from a legal perspective, but also from a physical integrity perspective, much to my delight, of course. So, in practice, if you're a bar, you can choose not to give a damn if the customers smoke. And in fact, you should choose that, because if you don't, cranky customers like yours truly can file a criminal complaint against you under Article 258 of the Romanian Penal Code concerning the usurping of an official quality. You're a bar owner, not the police. And under this rationale, the smart bar owners who didn't want to lose customers like me carried on as usual and ignored the law. They got a few fines at first in 16 and 17 and then successfully challenged them in court exactly under this rationale until everyone in the administrative apparatus just gave up because the fines against regular plebs are small and expensive to collect, and if fining companies is difficult or impossible, then the path of least resistance is to stop bothering. And this is the first lesson in this video. Success in administrative lawfare is measured in the de facto removal of the problem rather than de jure. The anti-smoking law is still there, but it only creates effects on those who are ignorant of the fact that it can be ignored. Lesson number 2. The most effective result of administrative lawfare is the one where you create the conditions under which the natural progress of bureaucracy via the path of least resistance coincides with your goals. That is not the only possible outcome, of course, but it's the ideal outcome because it is very resilient, almost as resilient as getting permanent jurisprudence in your favor, except it can be achieved at minimal financial costs and doesn't require you to put yourself on the spot by arguing cases at the Supreme Court or the equivalent in your jurisdiction. Alright, so how do you apply this? Well, this is why I didn't quite want to make this video, because there is no single best way to do it, and it all depends on the context and jurisdiction and peculiarities of the judicial system and the jurisprudence of the area or country in question. Still, there are a few general rules. The first thing you should do is decide who the enemy is, and I don't mean just the individual person, yet we'll get there in a few minutes, but who is the category or the institution that is the enemy. So for instance, if the enemy is medical doctors, then the next thing you need to do is start reading up on the entirety of the jurisprudence on medicine in your country or jurisdiction. In Europe, doctors aren't exactly a liberal profession like carpenters or welders, but rather a highly regulated profession that is quite literally buried under jurisprudence. Now, I'm not saying that's a good thing or a bad thing, but I am saying that if you decide to go against a doctor, you first need to know everything there is to know about who regulates doctors, what legislation applies, and most importantly, what legal procedure can be used against that doctor. In North America, doctors are regulated routinely by semi-private bodies which function more or less like medieval guilds. Those are a bit harder to crack via administrative lawfare, which is why in the US other tools are turned out to be, well, more successful, like lobbying local legislatures, running for the health board, which is in many states and localities in the US is a politically elected position, which is quite fun, or targeted civil lawsuits, which, although expensive, can be highly effective in North America and in the United States in particular. In Europe, on the other hand, there are a plethora of administrative lawfare tools at one's disposal. The hard part is navigating the labyrinth and figuring out which one is best for the particular purpose. So, for instance, when I taped the intro, I was just coming out of a lawsuit where a woman is contesting a doctor's right to practice. Since 2014, I am no longer allowed to represent anyone in court without paying a huge bribe to the Lawyers Guild. But nothing stops me from writing lawsuits for free for other people to use. In the case of doctors, I routinely do it for free if the likelihood of success is high because, as you all know, I really love the medical profession, specifically to inflict harm on them just because I can. The defendant in this case botched some medical procedures due to incompetence and moral corruption. My interest is to get him out of the profession because he had the wrong opinions during the pandemic project. Generally speaking, people who use their power to usurp my freedom should absolutely expect that I will try to harm their interests for the most random reasons possible, just because I can. So, while I can't get into the details of the case, I can tell you that in most of Europe, doctors are regulated by an institution that is usually called the Medical Council. So that's the first place you need to go to and to complain against a doctor. Now, you almost never win there because the medical councils are just as illegitimate as the medical profession in general. Perhaps even more so, given that you're supposed to believe that other doctors will sanction another doctor because their actions harmed a taxpayer. Given the medical profession, given that the medical errors are the second or third leading cause of death, depending on which study you choose to believe, it is perfectly clear that these medical councils are useless. Nevertheless, that's what the procedure says, and as we always say, procedure is God. Now, once you get the resolution from there, regardless of its content, that's when administrative lawfare starts, because their decision is an administrative act. And under civil law, again anywhere in Europe, any administrative act can be challenged in court, specifically in administrative court. The French have the most well-organized system because they have a Supreme Court for administrative lawfare called Conseil d'État, which is quite neat, and I wish my country had that. Le Conseil d'État, for instance, ruled in November 2020 that it is absolutely haram to limit church attendance for any reason, and least of all through an administrative ad interim act. In Romania, we had to fight all the way up to the Constitutional Court for that. Admittedly, our win was better because it has deeper consequences, but it also took longer. So, once you get the medical council ruling, how to challenge it in court is the next battle. And here, people tend to think that you can only challenge it based on the specific hospital or medical-related legislation or jurisprudence surrounding the medical council. That's a common mistake, and it's a wrong assumption. The reason any bureaucrat, and doctors in Europe are bureaucrats at the end of the day, legally speaking, so the reason any bureaucrat is afraid of the administrative court is because if the plaintiff is smart, or advised by someone smart, or rich enough to afford a top lawyer, the bureaucrat is tasked with answering multiple challenges, all of them bundled up in one $10 lawsuit. So for instance, you can add in the claim breaches of other provisions, such as patients' rights. Did you know that the doctor is not allowed to talk on WhatsApp about you with everyone else, or with actually anyone else? That breaches not just the right to medical privacy, but also the general European jurisprudence surrounding the transmission of sensitive data outside the European Union. WhatsApp is American, therefore haram. Also, each specialization of doctor has its own set of regulations and procedures, those infra-legal acts that I was mentioning at the beginning of the video. So what works against one doctor may not work against another one. That's why the second step you need to take is to pick your target carefully. Once you learn the general jurisprudence, the next thing you do is sift through it and see what can be applied in the particular case. This can be very difficult in North America, where there are 7 or sometimes 8 layers of jurisprudence between an individual bureaucrat, doctor or otherwise, and the federal regulations. That's why in North America, administrative warfare on doctors is very difficult and expensive. In Europe, however, there are usually 3 layers, and 4 in de facto federal countries. And unlike the US, the actual financial cost is routinely negligible. You can take down a doctor for less than $200. But the downside is that it can take up to 3 years. The upside is that if you win, you recoup all your financial expenses from the doctor as ordered by the court, because here the loser pays, and then the doctor may need as much as 7 years to recover from this, which, in my opinion, in certain cases, this is an optimal outcome. The third thing you need in order to be engaged in this sport is a willingness to be mean, petty, pedantic, and relentless. And I mean that very literally. Because oftentimes the chance of winning may be low, but it may still be worth pursuing it under the mentality that the process is the punishment. This is easier to do with criminal law in Europe, but if you abuse the criminal law, you may get yourself into trouble. The good news is that bureaucrats in general, and doctors in particular, are routinely morally reprehensible people who commit a multitude of crimes as a matter of routine. Therefore, your risk of being charged with abuse of criminal law is pretty low. Still, engagement in administrative lawfare does require a certain type of personality that not everyone possesses. Also, in February, I had my last appearance in court in a lawsuit against a local police force. The dumbfucks appealed the decision that had ruled in my favor that me being fined for not wearing a muzzle represents an abuse, and the IRS trying to actually charge the fine, even when it was ruled unconstitutional, represents an additional abuse and should thus pay me some reparations. They could have stopped there. The reparations were absolutely marginal. But no, they persisted. So as a result, I persisted as well and upped the ante by bringing in even more claims, including financial. In the final ruling, they have to pay me almost 10 times more than the original ruling. And the judge was so pissed off that it ordered the reparations be paid in solidarity from both the IRS budget and the local police force budget, which in practice usually means straight up from the salary of the individual police officer who was a Karen in public. Once that happens, I have several other claims ready against the individual police officer as well. I may not win them, but she will not have an easy life at least until 2030. And if I win, she won't be in any law enforcement agency ever, basically. None of this would have happened had she chosen not to be a Karen, and all of this, it is possible thanks to the wonders of administrative law. Now, to be truly effective, a mix between administrative lawfare, criminal law, and good old intimidation works best. Oh, sorry, did I say intimidation? Now, what I mean is a special persuasion operation. You see, making threats is a crime, but explaining in great detail how you will use the law to purposefully make the bureaucrat's life a living hell is not a crime. Alinsky's rule number 1, power is not only what you have, but what the enemy thinks you have. And rule number 9, the threat is usually more terrifying than the thing itself. So, something like this. Look, sir, this is a violation of the administrative code, and given that I also know about this and these violations that you've committed in the last 3 months and for which the statute of limitations hasn't expired, it would be quite a shame to have to argue all of this in court, wouldn't it? Oh, by the way, administrative lawsuits aren't protected by secrecy laws, so you can rest assured that every single newspaper in the region will talk about it, and if you do get an injunction on some of them, once I win, I will still be able to publish the court's final ruling, which may make things quite difficult for the promotion that I heard you're expecting. Or words to that effect. Now, some people go even further and straight up lie about it when they engage in persuasion operations. I don't, because I assume I'm being recorded and have gotten into the habit of avoiding saying anything that can successfully be used against me in a court of law. Describing realistic outcomes of an administrative lawsuit to determine someone to strictly observe the law is not a crime. Lying about what you can do can work, but only if your bluff is not called. I'm always prepared for my bluff to be called, and because I do deliver in full, over time in some counties of Romania, that got me a reputation of, well, you really don't want to mess with that guy, which others may enjoy, but I don't because I'm not doing anything too special. As I always say, I didn't make the rules. I just got here. So all I do is use the legitimate and legal tools at my disposal to make sure the rules are enforced when it benefits my interests or the interests of my people. Now, when I say that this is a practical application of Alinsky tactics, I'm not saying it for shock value. It's quite literally how I make decisions every step of the way. So for instance, rule number 3, wherever possible, go outside the expertise of the enemy. This was my main guidance during the pandemic project. When I fought bureaucrats, I would make exclusively medical and scientific arguments. When I fought doctors, I would make exclusively legal, jurisprudential, philosophical, moral, and constitutional arguments. The point is, of course, to get the opposition off balance, because bureaucrats aren't accustomed to having to explain themselves. So they will almost always mess things up when put on the spot in a court of law that doesn't work like in the movies. Like seriously, TV shows with lawyers are the biggest disservice. In the real world, courts of law are usually boring and full of procedural jargon. This is especially the case in administrative courts. Or take rule number 4, make the enemy live up to its own book of rules. This is the fundamental premise of administrative lawfare. Or my favorite, rule number 13, pick the target, freeze it, personalize it, and polarize it. You see, the enemy is not the system or the man, as the Americans say. No. The enemy is a few people with names, addresses, social security numbers, and bank accounts. I did this thousands of times, without exaggeration, during the pandemic project. Someone would come up and say, well, the local public health directorate decided this and that, and I'm like, no, that's the wrong answer, mate. There is no such thing as the public health directorate. There's people. Who is the director there? Who writes his or her policies? Who gets a vote? Who are these people? Where do they live? What is their financial interest? Let's explore. And this is where I mean pettiness, because oftentimes victories don't come from straight-up challenges to a specific policy, but a challenge to something that appears to be prima facie, or at the first sight, totally unrelated. For instance, I found out that a head of a health board held some shares in several businesses related to gambling and also had a small tourist resort. So I filed a criminal complaint on conflict of interest because the COOF regulations had all sorts of weird exemptions for gambling spots. Then I read all of the regulations concerning that particular type of tourist establishment, then went there and observed, noticed a few irregularities, and then called all of the relevant institutions to come in and inspect. Within 3 weeks, the entirety of the financial security arrangement of that individual was in jeopardy. Turns out there were even more things wrong with his business than I had initially thought. It also helped that those institutions were led by people of another political party than the head of the health board. And here it helps a lot to know the targeted community really well and play their interest against one another. One thing led to another and he's no longer in the health department. Oh no. And to this day, he hasn't been replaced either, because his colleagues are rightfully afraid that what happened to him will happen to them. And they're right. I am carefully studying their personal businesses as well. Did I ever care about their corruption prior to that? No, of course not, and I still don't, quite frankly. But they decided to mind my business, so now I mind their business in return. Not forever, but I have no intention of stopping before 2030. Years of psychological, legal, and financial torment are, in my opinion, appropriate punishment for their role in the pandemic project. Now, a bit more on pettiness. If you're not willing to go outside the expertise of the enemy, then you're not fit for the usage of this tool. Most people who try end up giving up somewhere in the middle of the process because they eventually buy into the propaganda that you can't win an administrative fight unless you're an expert yourself. Well, I'm not an expert, yet I won about 80%, 79% of administrative fights I engaged in. And most of the time, the decisive factor is not expertise, but the ability to out-petty the bureaucrat's own pettiness. Because you have to remember, most of administrative law is written by petty bureaucrats with the intention of defending them against you. But almost always those same rules can be turned around, and most bureaucrats are firmly convinced that this is not possible. That's why they argue so convincingly, because they genuinely believe their own propaganda. Another key component is the ability to think strategically and never lose sight of the price. The goal is not to get direct justice. Sometimes that happens, but that should not be the aim. The aim is to get indirect justice. The difference in result is marginal, but the difference in approach is quite significant. Administrative lawfare is a tool of activism that has specific purposes. It's not an all-purpose weapon. And it's not for everyone either. If you're the kind of people-pleaser type of personality, highly extrovert and friends of everyone, administrative lawfare may not be for you. Why? Because you may have to intentionally sabotage people you hang out with at work. I can do that without any problem and sleep very well at night without ever giving a second thought about how that person feels. But if you can't do that, then please consider a different tool in the activist toolbox, or externalize this part to someone else. Heck, most of the stuff I'm involved in right now is externalized to me in part. Now, I don't mind, but I'm also picky. For instance, I don't care about corruption among, let's say, architects. So I won't go into an administrative fight with them. They didn't harm me or my interests or the interests of my people. But bureaucrats, doctors, or police officer, oh yeah, of course, give me all. Especially if they supported minding my business in 2020, 2021, and 2022. And luckily, their positions and deeds are a matter of public record. The point overall is not to get after every single one of them, of course. That would be impossible even if I ran an organization of 1,000 people like me, let alone in a very tiny organization like the Freedom Alternative Network. The point, however, is to take enough scalps that it creates a climate of opinion among the enemy that A, there are people out there who do see you as the enemy and they're willing and capable enough to fight back, albeit slowly and sometimes amateurishly, but still deal quite significant enough damage. B, nobody is safe because they attack more or less at random, at least from their perspective, I'll get back to this. And C, that their motivation is vengeance for the pandemic project or for something else. The latter one is very important. You have to make sure that the target knows why he or she is being tormented through administrative warfare. The longer it drags on, the more important it is for the target to be aware of why this happens. Now, your motivation may be different from mine, but it is important that the target finds out why, even if at the end of the process. And it's not hard to make that happen. Usually the target will try to make contact in order to negotiate. Now, my happiest moments are when I get to tell the target that they can't afford to buy me off. Oh, this is another aspect you learn pretty quickly if you do administrative lawfare. Whatever you believed about how corrupt bureaucrats are, the reality is always far worse. But what's even worse is how spineless and slimy bureaucrats are. They will bend the knee to anyone who manifests a bit of power. And this is highly important piece of information if your intention is to take over an institution. Oftentimes the bureaucrats themselves might help you with that under the proper circumstances and with the right incentives. And again, I'm not talking anything illegal here because power against a bureaucrat absolutely can be manifested legally. And that's why they're so mortally afraid of administrative lawfare. Now, a word on how to pick targets. I was saying earlier that from the enemy's perspective, they perceive the attacks at random. Ideally, you should maintain that perception among the enemy if you can. It's not always possible, but when it is, work as hard as possible to maintain that perception. The more random the appearance, the more off balance the enemy is. But of course, the choosing of targets is not random. But it's not carefully planned either, at least not in my experience. Generally, in my experience, it's crime of opportunity, so to speak. In other words, you choose which institution to target or which profession, but for maximizing success and minimizing your time wasted, you should pick the weakest link first and then build up from there. Sometimes the weakest link is the director, which is great, but sometimes it can be a deputy or someone in the board or someone even lower in rank. In such situations, it's better to pursue anyway and get a win rather than be discouraged. Because more often than not, even a low-level scalp can bring panic in the ranks of the targeted institution. And panic leads to rash decision-making, which leads to administrative mistakes, which then leads for more threads you can grab in future administrative lawfare attempts. All in all, it depends on how much patience you got. Alright, so, to sum up-ish. Administrative lawfare can be learned by anyone, but those of a particular personality type are inherently advantaged compared to others. This tool is not an all-purpose weapon, and its effectiveness increases when coupled with other tools such as slaps, agitprop, and engaging in the competition. For instance, we're thinking of placing a few of our own people in the county health boards in the next few years. They will participate in the competition for those positions honestly, but their competitors will be buried under lawsuits just as the competition starts. And during the persuasion or campaign period, the legal problems of our competitors will be incessantly emphasized. Is that unfair? Yes, but it's also effective. And this is how they got their power to begin with. If anything, this method is a monument of rigorous ethics compared to the methods the current bureaucrats used to acquire their power. Another thing to remember is that administrative law and procedure is for everything, so don't be shy to dig up dirt about the enemy. Did their children go to the wrong school bypassing the administrative code? Head for that too. I mean, I do. These people went after my family as well with their brainwashing and illiberal policies. So I will not just stay cool and impose boundaries upon myself in return. No. Combat rules exist only as long as all sides observe them. When one side breaks them, then everyone else is straight up stupid if they don't as well. In 2019, I wouldn't have gone after the children of the enemy. Now, just give me the relevant data and I will if the conditions are met. No mercy, no amnesty. And one last thing to remember is that these tools exist regardless of your moral qualms with them. And they will be used against you if the context is right. So if you have a moral qualm with administrative lawfare, that's a you problem. These tools exist and have been deployed against you as a citizen as a matter of routine for the entire duration of your life. Not fighting back is a choice. And it can be a legitimate choice as well, but you need to understand that it is a choice. You are not an innocent victim because you choose not to fight. That's why, since the pandemic project, I stopped caring about the opinions of those who just talk the right things but refuse even the slightest involvement in walking the talk. This approach hasn't brought me too many new friends, granted, but it has brought me more peace and quietness. There's much more to be gained by fighting back in a consequential manner than by making clicks on social media. But that's a story for another day. So yeah, that's the basics of administrative lawfare. A bit of a rambling video because, again, it's all context dependent. A step-by-step guide cannot be made that it's also valid for more than one country and sometimes for more than one region of a single country. It does require specialized reading from your community, which is probably why all of those who do this tend to have low or no social media profile, because you don't have the time to chase clicks when you're busy. So I should probably add this too. A lower level of narcissism tends to help. And with all of that being said, thank you all for watching, send me to the cartels, and I will see you all soon on the Freedom Alternative.